yoga, of course, is these days dominated by women, which is just goes with the territory, really. That there's a minority of men in sort of modern yoga, but yoga itself, war yoga, has this premise that ultimately for a warrior society, a male warrior culture, qualities that would come out from a physical practice, which also is a spiritual practice, would prepare them for battle, for fight. And then you could kind of transfer that in modern culture to the martial arts for wrestling. The Rig Veda ultimately is a book used by of sort of nomadic, violent, cattle raiding culture of a warrior culture, that venerated above all really the god Indra, but they're essentially a sort of cattle warrior culture. So the first mention of yoga is out of this context in terms of the word yoga. This idea that we have in the West is that yoga is this kind of very peaceful and breathe and calm, and there's nothing wrong with that. Even the term itself, hatha yoga, means violent yoga. It's
that's an interesting factoid, because I had a hatha yoga teacher. His catchphrase was, make sure you're making love to your body, not war on your body. He would say this like every class. And I was like, I wonder what he would think if he knew the meaning of hatha. Something I've been really fascinated about, and maybe you're the only person I could talk about this with, is the cultural movement patterns you see in different martial arts. I've trained in a few different countries. I've trained in different martial arts, and I noticed that, say in India, there's certain patterns you see consistent with Indian wrestling and yoga, Tai Chi and Wing Chun, and even the way some Chinese MMA fighters fight seems to be informed by these movement patterns.
On one side, there is just that there are fundamental human movements which are just like work with the human body. But yeah, I mean, that's correct. The Thais fight the way they do because it comes out of their battlefields. Boy means to fight, so Boran means old, ancient. So it's like the ancient fighting style, which was used on the battlefield when you ran out of weapons and you just had nothing and you had to just try and kill people with your bare hands. And then that ultimately became Muay Thai. Yeah, there's a cultural pattern to everything in terms of certain movements.
But on the martial arts thing, I've always found it really fascinating how even within boxing, Western European versus Eastern Europeans throw the left hook so differently.
We in the West, because of glove boxing, have tended to sit into our punches and really try and hit hard and ground in and punch hard, whereas the Soviets actually took the old bare knuckle style, which was actually used amongst the aristocracy, and it kind of died out. And then when the Olympics started, they wanted to get into amateur boxing, which is points based. So it doesn't matter about really knocking people out in the same way. It was about getting in and out and scoring shots. And so ultimately the whole style developed from this fusion where they basically got these old guys who knew some of the old pugilistic bare knuckle from, early 20th century who are still around, kind of teach a few of the other guys. And essentially they developed a whole style out of this whole other lineage, which was developed purely for the amateur, but then translated really well into professional, but with a completely different style. So it's kind of fascinating actually how that developed.
Someone was saying that in Russia they punch the way they do because they're used to fighting on ice, and like a casting punch you can balance better than if you're throwing like a Mike Tyson tight hook. If you slip, you're on your butt.
I mean, no, it's pretty wild claim, but I mean it's possible. I mean, the Persians, the Iranians, the reason they do their push-up the way they do on a board is that it's from when they were out in the desert or in the sandy ground battlefields doing their exercises.
One thing about the spiritual aspect that I found very interesting in your book was, I think it was a Pantajali quote, something about yogins must consider the gods as their enemy.
This is actually the Indian concepts there, which is why they have this idea of Ati Deva, which is to go beyond the gods, beyond Deva. Which is a capability of the human being because we have this divine spark within us, which is the Atman in the Indian tradition. This sort of idea that there is a capability of the human being to create this adamantine, immortal spirit, but that the gods don't want that. So you have to fight against them in that regard. They're your enemy in the regard they'll put things in your way to stop you achieving them.
So is it almost like making an analogy to an athlete with a really terrorizing coach who's like constantly putting up, the new challenge, next rep, and you're trying to beat him, but not really beat him, let's say. Participating in like pagan rituals, it's kind of maybe symbolic of greater archetypes, let's say.
The idea of a ritual is that you basically you perform an act which has an effect on the cosmos. Well, the idea that a human being is a microcosm of the macrocosm. So, you are the manifestation of the divine right here, and that the kind of universe and cosmos is also within you, So ritual for me not only has this idea of affecting external, but is more of an internal effect. I feel like the kind of alchemical change, it's more of an alchemical change within, or kind of intention that you can set within yourself. Sacrifice being the idea that you can sacrifice the lower self to the higher self. One of the things about WarYoga is the idea that, you have to basically kind of forge your own path. So that for me is the idea of ritual, is that actually you can kind of create a better, more powerful version of you if you kind of utilizing that correctly. That's at the basis of WarYoga, is this idea that, the physical exercise isn't just about the physical exercise. And then on the other side, you can tie in sort of philosophical and spiritual elements and make it into a much more powerful vehicle than just making your physical body stronger. You can work on a metaphysical level rather than just a physical level,